In this video, I'm going to show you how to get Sega Dreamcast, Naomi, and Atomiswave games running on an Xbox Series X or S using the Flycast core. I'm a pretty big fan of the Sega Dreamcast. I didn't have one during the time it was actually active, sadly. I ended up picking one up a couple years after it had already died in 2006, but I just have always loved it ever since. I just love the game selection, I love the system itself, I loved its attempts at online connectivity, and hey, it brought me Phantasy Star Online, so there's another winner there. And for the longest time, Dreamcast emulation has just been really hard. There was just never a good all-in-one solution for Dreamcast. You always had to switch between a couple of different emulators for a while. But thankfully, those dark days are behind us, and we have the Flycast core, which can handle pretty much anything the Dreamcast has to offer, with the added bonus of Naomi and Atomiswave game support. And better still, all of these games can now run on your Xbox Series X or S, and that's why we're here today. Let's go ahead and get this set up and running. Now, before we begin, this guide is a continuation of my initial Retroarch setup video, so be sure to check that out for any settings I have set in that video before diving into this one, otherwise there will just be some mismatches. And also check out the expanded dev mode storage tutorial, as we will be diving into storing games internally for this one. Now, to start playing Dreamcast, Naomi, and Atomiswave games, there's a lot of things you need to take into consideration. First of all, you need to find games. I have a guide on my channel for how to dump your own Dreamcast games, so you can check that out, rip your entire Dreamcast collection very easily. But for Naomi and Atomiswave games, it requires very specialized hardware to dump these main boards. So I'm sure that most people will resort to the shady parts of the internets to get these guys. Do note they need to be in MAME format, so zip files with subfolders with extra data stuff. And same thing with the Atomiswave games, they're just in MAME format, so zip files. But for Dreamcast games, these can be in either GDI, CDI, or CHD format. And this is all going to depend on how you want to store them on your Xbox. Now, I prefer to keep my Dreamcast games in GDI format. I don't like to change them over to CDI because sometimes you have to compress music or videos or something like that, and it just diminishes the game in my opinion. So I'm not a fan of CDI. The problem with GDI, though, is that it has a ton of files within it. So you have the main GDI file that then looks for these other tracks to run the game. And for the Xbox Series consoles, this is proving problematic if you want to run your games externally. So multi-track games like this just don't work from the external drive. It'll copy over the GDI file, but none of the extra files, so your games will just not run. So if you want to play Dreamcast games in GDI format and not have to worry about converting them or compressing them into a single file, you will need to store them all internally. To do this, power on your Xbox and make sure it's connected to your network, and then navigate to your Xbox device portal on a web browser. So you should all know how to do this by now if you've installed Retroarch, so I'm not going to go over getting here. But anyway, go to File Explorer and click on Browse. These set of instructions will pop up, and this will let us access our Xbox drive from our computer. So you can copy in this File Explorer address right here, complete with username and password, or if you don't want to enter a password, you can copy this command key here and insert it into a command prompt, so that way you can just go into it without having to do username and password. Again, I go into more depth with this in my expanded storage tutorial, so be sure to check that out. But for now, copy this File Explorer address, open up a File Explorer, so my PC or whatever, go up to the navigation bar and paste in the address, and then hit enter. If you'd like to make your life super easy, you can actually map this as a network drive, so you can click on Map Network Drive, and then you can paste the address in right there and save it as a drive letter. And then make sure Reconnect at Sign On isn't active, otherwise you'll just keep getting pop-ups saying it can't connect if your Xbox is turned off, so just leave that off. And then click Finish when you're done. So I already went ahead and did that, and it's right here as my X drive. The other added benefit of this is you can see how much space you have left on your dev mode storage. So I just think that's a really cool life hack to make your life a little bit simpler, but you don't have to do that. You can just paste it up here and go for it. Either way works. But once you're in, you're going to go to Windows Apps, go to your Retroarch folder. It is usually this second one for me, but it'll be labeled the version number of Retroarch with the follow-up of X64. That's how you know you're in the right one. And then you could also see like all these Retroarch files to really make sure you're in the right folder. But I previously had made a games folder inside this folder, and that is where I stored my Wii games earlier. So we're just going to go into this folder. I'm going to make a new folder called Dreamcast. And I'm going to copy over all of Shenmue. Why not? There we go. Shenmue, you're going to internal storage there, buddy. And now when I load up Retroarch, I can load up this copy of Shenmue as a GDI file and have no problems. But if I were to try to copy this to my USB drive, it would just crash and not load. So if you want to leave them as GDI, they need to go on internal. I personally prefer to run my games from an external drive just to save space on the internal drive for my dual-layer Wii or PS2 games, personally. So instead of doing that, I'm actually going to compress down my Dreamcast games to CHD format. That way it gets rid of a bunch of extra data space that's on these games, because every GD-ROM takes up exactly 1.1 gig, whereas a lot of these games are actually the size of a CD, so you could save a good 300 to 400 or more megabytes per disc if you compress them. But basically you need to have a program called Chudman, and I'll upload this program to my file share and give you guys a link in the description. But anyway, copy Chudman and GDI to chud.bat, and then just paste it into every folder that you want to compress. And once you have that in place, just run the script q or gdi to chud.bat, and it will compress your games into a single file. This process can take a bit, so be patient, especially if you have a lot of games. That will take you a while. So I'm just going to go ahead and skip the video ahead until after I've had all of my games compressed. Now that all my games are compressed into a single CHD format file, I can go ahead and copy my Dreamcast games folder onto my USB drive. And now the same steps apply to Naomi games, so look at the way your games are formatted. If they are just a single zip file, they can go on your USB drive, but if they are a zip file and a subfolder that has a CHD format file in it, these need to go on the internal drive of your Xbox. So again, the process is going to be pretty much the same. You go into your Xbox drive here through the File Explorer. I'm going to create a new folder, name it Naomi Games. And I'm going to put this dump of Ikaruga on there. Done. And now for these two, for Crazy Taxi and Marvel vs. Capcom 2, I'm just going to put them onto my USB drive. And then from what I could tell, Atomiswave games are all just single zip formatted games, so those should be safe to just go on your USB drive as well. Now that we've got our games situated, we need to come up with the required BIOS files to get them all to run. So we're going to need an Atomiswave BIOS set, a Naomi BIOS set, and then a Dreamcast BIOS set. I have a video on my channel showing you how to dump a Dreamcast BIOS from your own console. For Naomi and Atomiswave, you're going to have to resort to the shady nets, sadly. Like, dumping your own is freaking difficult. Again, I will not be providing links, as sharing links is illegal. I am just here to show you how to get it set up once you have this stuff. But once you have all of them sourced, you need to put them in a folder named DC, lowercase, uppercase. I don't think it should matter, but I do it lowercase. And then copy that over to your USB drive as well. Once you have all these files situated, you can close out of everything, take your USB drive out of your computer, and put it into your Xbox. If this is the first time you've inserted your USB drive into an Xbox, it will ask you if you want to format it as Xbox storage or media storage. Choose media, otherwise everything you have on that USB drive will be deleted. But once your USB drive is detected and in place, we are going to launch into the My Files Explorer app, and place our DC folder within our Retroarch system folder. So launch My Files Explorer, navigate to Removable Storage Devices, Removable Disk E, and find your DC folder that you put in here on your computer. Press Start, copy folder, navigate to Isolated Storage over here on the left, press A. Up in the navigation bar, click on Packages. And now the Retroarch folder for me is traditionally the top folder. You can explore all of your oddly named folders to see which one happens to be your Retroarch folder, but for me it's always been this top one. So I'm going to go in there, local state, and look, it's my Retroarch folder. Awesome. Anyway, find the system folder. Now press Start and paste in your DC folder. Ta-da! Once that's in place, we can go back to our home menu and launch Retroarch. Now that Retroarch is loaded, we can begin loading up our games. So we can go down to Load Content, go to our E drive, and we can choose between our Atomiswave, Dreamcast, or Naomi titles. And if you have your stuff stored to the internal drive, you just go to S, Program Files, Windows Apps, Retroarch folder, Games folder, and Dreamcast games and Naomi games. I really can't stand this method, so I'm going to show you how to make a playlist for all three of these systems. Pressing right or left on your D-pad, you can get to the Import Content tab. From here, I'm going to do a manual scan. Content directory, I'm going to do Dreamcast first. Scan this directory, system name. Press right on your D-pad to scroll down to Sega, and find Dreamcast. Default core, same thing, right on your D-pad to Sega, and find the Flycast core. Make sure Scan Recursively is on if you have subfolders, and then start scan. Now if this worked as it should, there'll be a nice Dreamcast controller icon over here with all of my games. And sure enough, there it is. Now I'm going to go back in and add Disk 1 of Shenmue, so I'm going to scan a file manually here. I'm going to scroll to S, Program Files, Windows Apps, Retroarch folder, Games, Dreamcast games, Shenmue Disk 1, and I'm going to choose my GDI file. And now back over in my little Dreamcast playlist, I should have a new Shenmue entry for Disk 1, and there it is. And of course, you will do this wherever you have your games stored, whether it be internally or externally. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing for Atomiswave. So manual scan. I have mine stored on the external, so Atomiswave games. System name. Now unfortunately there isn't a separate entry for Atomiswave, so I'm just going to list this as MAME for now because MAME handles arcade systems, so scroll up, I'm going to choose MAME. And then default core remains Dreamcast/Naomi Flycast. And I'm going to start the scan. And now I have a Metal Slug entry here for under a MAME playlist. And then I'm going to do the same thing for Naomi games. First I'm going to do my external ones, so Naomi games. Select this folder, I'm going to leave this on MAME. Sega Dreamcast Naomi, there we go. And I'm going to start the scan. And now I've got Crazy Taxi and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 here as well. Now I'm going to do the same thing with that Ikaruga file, so I'm going to do a manual scan. I'm going to point it to my S folder here, so S, Program Files, Windows Apps, Retroarch folder, Games folder, Naomi games, scan this directory. I'm going to leave it as MAME, Sega Dreamcast/Naomi, and this time I'm going to tell it to not scan recursively because I just want it to find the zip file and not search that chud file. And I'm going to start the scan. And now I have an Ikaruga playlist entry as well. So from here I'm free to start loading up games, so I'm just going to load up a Dreamcast game real quick. Let's go ahead and load up Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. And now Dreamcast games are up and running on an Xbox Series X. And as you can see, Dreamcast games are running pretty great on the Xbox Series X. There are a couple of things that we want to change before we get too involved into gameplay. So once you load up a Dreamcast game, just press your quick menu button. Scroll down to options. You may notice that the scrolling is like really broken. You try to press it once, it goes down like 5 entries. Like, you can just trial and error it until you get to options, or you can plug in a keyboard to make this a lot easier. It's still a little sensitive, but it's a lot easier for me personally if I have a keyboard hooked up for this one to get to the options menu. But from here, we're going to scroll down to near the bottom-ish, and we're going to turn on threaded rendering. This gives Dreamcast games a massive performance boost, and for Atomiswave and Naomi games, this is pretty much the only way I've been able to get them to not lag. So enable threaded rendering. But once you have that set, back out of this menu, go to overrides, and save the core overrides. So that way, anytime you load up a Dreamcast, Atomiswave, or Naomi game, you will have threaded rendering on. Once that core override is saved, just back out to your quick menu again. It might send you a little bit further, but then close the content, and then you can launch right back in. But now that threaded rendering is on, performance is a lot more solid, and it comes with the added benefit of being able to actually navigate our quick menu without it just absolutely crapping the bed. So this is going to be important for when we want to go over core options later. But now that we know that Dreamcast games are up and running, let's go ahead and try out one of those arcade systems. So I'm going to start with Atomiswave. I'm going to load up Metal Slug 6. And there we go. Metal Slug 6 has loaded up. And there we go. Metal Slug 6 title menu. You can press back on your controller to add credits. And then just press the start button. And it just runs like an absolute dream. So for those of you that were curious, when I didn't have threaded rendering enabled, when a lot of action would happen on screen in Metal Slug 6, I would actually get some pretty big lag moments. But with threaded rendering on, the game just runs absolutely perfectly. This scene in particular was an exceptionally bad performer before I enabled threaded rendering. It still doesn't look as smooth as it should, and there are a couple moments of hiccups, but overall it runs so much better than it did before. Now that we know we have Atomiswave running, I'm going to try out a Naomi game, so Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And it boots right up as a single game file should. Couple graphical glitches in this one, but overall it's looking pretty good. And it runs great. The controls aren't what I'm used to when it comes to Marvel vs. Capcom 2 from having played it on Dreamcast and Xbox, but you can remap those as you see fit. But as you can see, the game is just running like an absolute dream, other than my terrible playing. But what about those games we stored on the internal drive? Let's go ahead and give those a shot real quick, just to make sure that they are loading up correctly in our playlist. So first up, Ikaruga. This is the Naomi version. And it did load up as expected. So Ikaruga is one of the best shooters ever. If you've never played this, it is so tough. Like, even on easy, it can be very, very tough. I'm so glad this game just got another re-release on Switch and, like, PS4, I believe. But, like, this game is so good. But here it is in its original arcade iteration. And since I have integer scaling on, it actually makes the screen pretty small, but it's okay. It looks nice and crisp, and I just prefer it this way personally. And now let's check on Shenmue real quick. And it boots right up, even in GDI format, since I have it stored on the internal drive. Again, if I were to have put Shenmue on my external drive, it would have given me a failed to load content error and be absolutely unplayable. So for those of you looking to get Dreamcast games up and running, that's pretty much it. There are going to be a few games that still exhibit some graphical glitches. I haven't been able to find any settings to change that, so as you can see on Rio here, he's kind of got some clipping problems, and his eyeballs kind of stick out of his head sometimes, but overall, everything that I've tried to run on Dreamcast on the Series X has worked really well. And I haven't really tested too many Naomi or Atomiswave games, but the ones I have tried have also worked well. So overall, this should be a great experience for you on the Xbox Series X or S. There is one last thing I want to cover for all of you not interested in seeing what the core options do real quick, and that is how to change discs on multi-disc games like Shenmue. Going into the quick menu, you can scroll down to Disk Control, and if you need to do a disc change, you basically just press Eject Disk, go to Load New Disk, scroll to where your new disk is at, select it, and select the GDI or CHUD file that is needed. And then hit Insert Disk. And then you can just load into the new disk. So for Shenmue here, I have a save on disk 1, and it's going to tell me to change back to disk 1, so I can just go ahead and do that again real quick. So Eject Disk, Load New Disk, Disk 1, Insert Disk. And then I will load it back up. And it loaded right back up into my save on disk 1. So there's that for you. But now I'm going to just go ahead and cover the core options. So from the quick menu, just scroll down to Options. And starting from the top, we have Boot to BIOS. So if you toggle this on, it will only boot to the Dreamcast BIOS until you toggle it off. So unless you really need to mess with memory card settings, don't touch this. Next is System Type. I recommend leaving this set to auto, unless there is a game that you have for Dreamcast, Naomi, or Atomiswave that absolutely refuses to boot without it. Next is the HLE BIOS. We don't need this. We have BIOS files. The next entry is Internal Resolution, and this lets you up-res your games from the native 640 by 480 up to anything under the sun. All the way up to like 9K, 10K, whatever the frick that would be considered. But as you can see, as you start up-resing it, the graphics start to garble along the sides. That's fine. Look at what this option tells you to do. It says that you need to restart it after you set this. So some people have said that you're limited to 720p resolutions. That's just not true. What you need to do is set it to what you want. So I'm going to go up to 4K. Back out, close the content, and now when I've rebooted back into Shenmue, as you can see, it is running at a massively higher resolution without any of the abnormal graphic glitches. We still have the same graphic glitches we had before, but nothing introduced by the upscaling. So going back into my quick menu, options. Look at that, we are at 4K for Dreamcast games, well beyond that 720p limit that has been reported. If you'd like to push it beyond 4K, you will again start to see those glitches on the side of the screen start to appear, so you just have to restart it and it'll appear normally. But honestly, if you're already hitting 4K, I don't really see the need to push beyond this, on an Xbox at least. But just as a performance note, everything that I've tested in 4K is working just fine. I haven't noticed any additional slowdowns caused by the resolution, so you should be clear to play all your games in 4K. Do note that you will get stretching if you adjust your resolution this high for whatever reason. I don't understand it, but that's what happens. It stretches it out. So if you want to up-res your Dreamcast games without stretching, you are going to be stuck pretty much at 1080p, and I believe 1200p worked as well. But once I went up to 1440 and higher, that's when I got the stretching myself. Try it out, see what happens for you, but I'm going to stick with 1080p for myself. It up-reses it quite nicely, and it doesn't have stretching, which is exactly what I want. And then I'll just restart the content once again. And there we go. 1080p Dreamcast games, no stretching, looks absolutely fantastic. The next option on our list is screen orientation. So there are some games where you could rotate the screen to play them, and this is the option you would toggle for those. It does require a restart for it to take effect, so set it for the game you need it, restart it, and you should be good. Alpha sorting, we want this on per triangle. Next is GD-ROM fast loading. You can enable this to have your games load faster. Do know it will break a number of games, so I prefer to leave it off. MIP mapping and volume modifier, leave on. The next two options are widescreen related, so there's the widescreen hack, which will attempt to run your Dreamcast games in 16:9. You'll usually notice culling around the borders of the screen of the 4:3 frame, but pretty neat to mess with. And alternatively, there are widescreen cheats that you can enter in that will draw your Dreamcast games in widescreen. Next is cable type. By default is set to TV RGB. You could change this to composite or a VGA signal. For maximum compatibility, just leave this on TV RGB, but there are a couple of games that won't boot unless you have it set to VGA. Now, on an original Dreamcast, VGA was the way to go, but when it comes to emulation, I don't really notice a difference between the two. Next are broadcast and region. You shouldn't have to mess with these, but if you do, you just need to go in and select like your console region and like what type of TV signal you're outputting. And then language. This is especially useful for PAL games. You can set what the system language is going to be for multi-language games. Next is DIV matching. This kind of gives you a performance boost at the expense of being a less accurate emulation. The Dreamcast is not having trouble maintaining speed, so you shouldn't need this. Force window CE mode, ignore this. The next three options are all controller related. You can set your analog stick dead zone, trigger dead zones, and you can actually enable digital triggers so that way you don't have to worry about analog range on the triggers, especially useful for fighting games. This next toggle lets you turn on and off Dreamcast audio. Next is a texture upscaling method using XBRZ. So you can turn this on up to 6 times and it will smoothen out textures. You will need to restart the emulation for it to take effect. Then you can decide on the size that you want that to be at as well, up to 1024. Enable render to texture, have this on, and then enable render to texture buffer, have this on as well. Then you could also upscale the render to texture up to 8 times. Threaded rendering, we turned this on earlier because it just makes Dreamcast run absolutely amazing. But there are a couple of options that we want to enable with it to really smooth out the performance. If you just have this on, you may notice that some games seem to drop frames every so often. And that is what synchronous rendering tries to handle. And then you could also enable delay frame swapping to get rid of some glitching screen effects that might be caused by this. So these three options have on. Frame skipping ignore. Puru Puru pack is vibration, so if you want to have vibration on or off, right here. The next two options are for people that like HD texture packs. You can enable an HD texture pack, or you could dump textures to create your own HD texture pack. I recommend looking up a guide for HD texture packs because I'm actually not sure how they work on Flycast. I haven't ever messed with them on this emulator. The next option is per game VMUs, and if you have a lot of Dreamcast games, I recommend turning this one on, and you can choose between port 1 or all VMUs to have separate memory cards. I choose VMU A1 just because I don't need to have multiple extra memory cards for games. Just having this one is more than enough. The next option is show VMU display settings, and we're going to toggle this on. Press B, resume your game, and then go back into the quick menu, go back to options, and now at the bottom there are a slew of new VMU related options here. So the Dreamcast visual memory unit was such a cool little display. Like, it gave you some extra info, like just little at a glance things in games that used it right. So we can actually turn that on and have it displayed on our screen. And then you can choose the position, the size. I like 2x myself. You can change the pixel colors. I like to leave it on default. You can change the opacity so you can see the stuff underneath it still while also seeing it. And then you can do the same for controller port 2, 3, and 4. And then the last option is light gun settings. Now, light gun settings aren't going to be that useful to us just because we can't even really do light gun games on the Xbox Series X since we don't have mouse support for this version just yet. So you can just kind of ignore these ones. But that does it as far as core options are concerned. If we press B, we can go down to controls, and you can actually see a number of different control options that are available as well. So we have the standard Dreamcast controller, an arcade stick, the keyboard. So the keyboard can actually be used on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. Just make sure to hit the scroll lock key to disable all other hotkeys. So like you can play like Typing of the Dead on this version, but unfortunately the mouse does not work, which means light guns don't work. But then there's also twin stick, Saturn twin stick, and all that. So for the most part, you should be just fine leaving this on controller. Now, just a quick note on Naomi games. If you have them upscaled to 1080p, you will see stretching on these ones like we saw stretching at 4K on Dreamcast. So set your internal res accordingly, just depending on if you want stretching or not. And for Naomi games, when you load one up, there is actually an extra set of options here to allow for the service buttons and a 15 kilohertz dip switch. Shouldn't really need either, but they're here if you do. And the same two options show up for Atomiswave games as well. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you have VMU displays on, it will show up in Naomi and Atomiswave games as well, but not really be doing anything. So turn it off just so you don't have this stupid, useless space over on the side of the screen. So one last option I want to cover with you all before we call this video good is to set up a nice CRT shader for your Dreamcast and arcade games. So going into your quick menu, go down to Shaders, press A to enable them. Now you do need to have shaders downloaded, so press B to go back to the main menu if you haven't done so. Go to the online updater and update GLSL shaders. Once you have those downloaded and extracted, go back into the quick menu, shaders, load shader preset, shaders GLSL, CRT, and I get to go to my favorite CRT shader here, easy mode, because Dreamcast and Naomi games just look absolutely stunning with this shader on. Look at that, like, it just looks absolutely gorgeous. But once you have things set up for Flycast exactly as you like them, be sure to save a core override. That way you can always have these settings load up anytime you load up a Dreamcast, Naomi, or Atomiswave game. And if there's a setting you want to change, like having VMUs off for Naomi and Atomiswave, you can save those as game overrides. And I've had a number of you ask why shaders haven't been loading up automatically after you've set them. I found out that if you go into shaders, go to save, and save the core preset, that it should solve those problems for you. So now every time you load into Dreamcast, you'll have this shader and you won't need to manually enable it every single time. And that's going to do it for Dreamcast, Naomi, and Atomiswave emulation on an Xbox Series X or S. As always, if you have any questions, just ask them down in the comments below and I will do my best to try to help you out. I'm not the most familiar with arcade system stuff specifically, but I will still try to do my best to help you out. But now if you could all do me a huge favor and hit that like or dislike button, just depending how much you like today's tutorial. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that sub button so you can see whenever I upload a new tutorial just like this one. But let's go ahead and call that a wrap. So until next time, all of my wonderful internet peeps, stay awesome, and we will see you all back next video.